I think everyone watching our podcast probably already knows about the banking crisis, so we're not going to reiterate like what's going on. And in our last podcast, we went over the reasons why the banks are in this mess. So I just refer anyone who's listening to that last podcast, which sort of went over the whole issue of the mortgage-backed securities being underwater. A very crystallizing way in which this entire situation has been sort of boiled down is this bet that this tech entrepreneur, thinker, writer, philosopher, whatever you want to call him, his name is Balaji Srinivasan. And we met the other day at our meetup, and I was telling you about this bet. I followed Balaji for years. I've listened to a lot of his podcasts. He's been on guests on many different podcasts. The Alden podcast, Tim Ferriss, and Lex Friedman. He holds the record for the longest podcast that Lex has ever done, and it's almost 8 hours. And I've listened to it all. I say all of this because, I feel like I have a really good bullshit detector with people. But if some YouTuber who puts on orgasm faces on a thumbnails about Bitcoin, if he said something like that, right, then I would just dismiss it and just move on, right? But Balaji made a bet about 4 or 5 days ago where he said that because of the BTFP program that the fund created, which basically allows all the banks to lend from the Fed on the marked to par value of all of their securities, that this is going to flood the system with at least $1 trillion worth of money. And that was just 3-4 days ago. And today we're hearing that the United States is quote unquote studying ways in which to make sure all depositors in the United States that have deposits in all banks are fully covered. Okay, so that we're talking about, a few, $17 trillion or something that the Fed says that they want to guarantee. And, there's no doubt that's going to result in some additional money printing as well. So his contention is that all of this money printing, which is going to run into the trillions of dollars, all of this reintroduction of capital into the markets is going to cause absolute runaway inflation. In fact, he's calling for hyperinflation. And he's saying that the only lifeboat there is to escape this hyperinflation that exists today that didn't exist before is Bitcoin. He raised this alarm on the internet, and there was somebody on the internet who, on Twitter, who says, I'd bet anybody $1 million that hyperinflation is not going to happen. And then Balaji says, I'll take that bet. And he says, okay, here's the bet. The bet is that Bitcoin is going to be $1 million in 90 days. Then if it's not, then you win $1 million, right? You buy a Bitcoin and I buy $1 million, and if I win, then you have to give me the Bitcoin, and if you win, then I'll give you the $1 million. And he has defended his position on Twitter Spaces since then, and he's basically just tweeting up a storm every day, like he's just doing 10, 15 tweets a day, where he doubles and triples down. Saylor has talked about this. Saifuddin and Mose did a Twitter Spaces with Saylor just a couple of hours ago, where they're like, well, he may be directionally correct, but I don't know about the 1 million in 3 months. And even I don't know about the 1 million in 3 months. And, I think even Balaji is hinting at the idea that this is basically sort of a thought experiment kind of bet. It's a bet just to sort of make an intellectual point that we're entering a era of hyperinflation. Now, if Bitcoin hits $100,000 in 3 months instead of $1 million, I don't think anyone's going to be complaining. And Balaji said certainly not going to be like, oh, I feel so stupid, for like having said it was $1 million when I should have actually made it 100,000. People are not going to be complaining then either. The other thing that's happened as well, which happened exactly around the same time, is that Arthur Hayes, who is another person I follow quite closely, and another person whose intellect I really respect. I think he's a phenomenal mind. He wrote a very long blog just a few days ago, just I think one day before Balaji made this bet and raised the fire alarm about hyperinflation coming. But Arthur Hayes wrote a very long article, very detailed, explaining his own thesis about essentially that the money printer is turned on, and it's turned on with a vengeance. And he himself thinks the same principle, the same sort of line of argument that Balaji has, with much more detail this time. He himself feels that Bitcoin is heading towards some terribly high valuation. I'm hearing rumors that Balaji recently converted 99% of his net worth into Bitcoin, and Arthur Hayes and the in the blog as well says he's going to be majority Bitcoin going forward, like vast majority, like whatever. I don't think he did a number, but he says he's selling stocks and he may buy some land here and there, but for the most part, he's just going into crypto, and he's just incredibly bullish about the price of crypto. He's bullish because he says the traditional financial world is collapsing, and that's why Bitcoin is going to go up so high. So I mean, bullish in the face of like a financial destruction that's probably oncoming. I have to say, I feel like I'm a pretty sober person, and I, that's why I listen to people like, Arthur Hayes and Balaji, who I also think are very sober people, right? So Arthur Hayes like did a blog post maybe a year ago where he was very bearish. He's like, "Oh, we're in a bear market. Obviously, this is the bubbles popped, and like good luck. I'm going skiing," and he just disappeared for like a year. Then he reemerges when the banking crisis occurs. So what I'm getting at is I feel like I'm a sober person. I'm not a moon boy at all. I think Balaji's not a moon boy at all. He's never done anything like this. He's never been so hyperbolic. He's never been so aggressive. He's never, like, all of the sort of trust that people have built up over his intelligence and like, well, Balaji's a straight shooter. He's a sincere person. He's an ideological person. He's not in it just to like, gain some Twitter followers or whatever, right? I agree with all of that. I think that's his personality is not like that at all. It's just is very uncharacteristic of him. It's like, if you, I know you pretty well. I'm like if you tell me, hey man, you should try this thing called heroin, it's awesome. Like I would be concerned, right? I'm like, dude, Doug, we need to talk. This is not your personality at all. And it's the same with this Balaji thing is, like, I know he's not gone crazy, right? Because he's come on Twitter Spaces and, very cogently argued his position. And, these are his, he's explained why he feels this way. And it's not bullshit reasoning either. It makes a lot of logical sense, right? It's not, he also raised the alarm about COVID when that happened. And he raised the alarm, like, in January of 2020 when like nobody was paying attention, and he was talking about he did a whole long tweet thread where he was talking about remote work is going to go up and everyone's going to be wearing masks and there's probably going to be money printing, blah blah blah. He predicted almost everything that was going to happen down to a T. And everyone was like, dude, just sit down, man. There's just a few people sick in China. It's just not a problem, right? And he called it pandemic. He used the word pandemic in January 2020, and everything he predicted came to pass. That's the only time he's done something like predicting like some giant thing in the last few years. He's only done it once before, and the time he did it was with COVID. So when Balaji says something like this, like people take him seriously, like Saylor takes him seriously, and Saifuddin was taking him seriously. Everybody who is in the crypto space has now done a podcast about Balaji's prediction only because of his the esteem that people hold him in. He was the first CTO of Coinbase. He built the Coinbase technology from the ground up, right? And he was a general partner for Andreessen Horowitz as well. And he was the one who went to Andreessen Horowitz and says, you guys need to pay attention to this cryptocurrency thing. It's a real thing. And that was years ago. I don't know how many prizes he's won. He's written blog posts. He's written books. Anyone who wants to understand how smart and wide-ranging his intellect is needs to listen to the Lex Fridman podcast, because he covers so many different things in that 8 hours. You're like, man, is there something this guy doesn't know? I mean, he's just such a polymath, and he's just so effortlessly eloquent when he speaks about many, many various things. So what I'm getting at is, this is a person I take seriously. And when he says something as outrageous as Bitcoin is going to be $1 million in 30 days, and I'm betting money that that's going to happen, and I'm raising a file alarm that we need to like buy Bitcoin because the dollar's being devalued rapidly, I feel disturbed. It like really it has affected me psychologically. I mean, I have to like be frank with you. I've really been. Balaji's been living rent-free in my head for the last 5 days. So anyway, that's how I feel about it. That's sort of what has been on my mind. What are your thoughts, man? I mean, what do you think about this?
I guess there's like a couple things there to unpack. I think obviously what's the old saying, if you want to go somewhere you've never been, you got to do stuff you've never done. And obviously we're treading new water right now as a macro crypto community, as Americans, just citizens around the world. With that said, I think the one thing I don't know about you. One thing in the last year, I think has I've definitely tried to be more cognizant of is just if you say something like, for example, the Fed, they're using the word transitory, and now they're kind of backstepping because they're like, oh, well, we kind of meant this, and even though they might have intended that, it's like, well, if you say cat, but you're looking at a dog, it's So I guess the reason I bring that up is people say hyperinflation like a buzzword. You might have to correct me here, but isn't the working definition like 50% month over month or whatever?
I don't know what the working definition is, but it's yeah, that's directionally correct. Yeah.
But so it's like to the people listening at home, let's say you bought a car for $10,000 this month, and then April it's $15,000. Like that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So that's like, and I follow him too. I definitely am not. I wouldn't say you're a fanboy, but as a respect him as much. There's just I follow a lot of different people. I kind of get a synopsis, triangulate, and then I'm like, this is probably the closest thing to truth right now. I'm gonna rinse repeat next month. See what happens. But it's it, that's my main thing, and like you said it too. Like what, like if whether even if we only hit $100,000, people are going to be like, okay, cool, Bitcoin's going up. But that's the main thing that disturbs me because it's like, okay, if Bitcoin hits $1 million, like what's our market cap? We're like kissing gold or something stupid right now.
$20 trillion. No,
Yeah.
no, no.
Okay.
It is. Is it 20? Yeah, I think it's 20 trillion. So double the size of the gold.
And
Yeah.
this is my point. If that happens in 90 days, like and Pete Rizzo, like how you're kind of big on Balaji. One guy I really, really, really respect in the industry is Pete Rizzo. He reminds me of Rob a lot. He's in this space, but he's in this space because he's more intrigued by the bullshit than the stuff that the $1 million could work. And he even talked about this, I think like a year or two ago on the McCormick podcast that he's like, okay, let's say in 10 years we hit hyper Bitcoinization. Is that really, or he's like, in 5 years that we hit it, is that really good for Bitcoin? And McCormick goes, of course. And Rizzo goes, hold on, think. Okay, within let's call it a 2,000-day window, 1% of 1% of the population literally turns into, a king's ransom. And everyone else is
Yeah.
basically, hey, there's only 21 million Bitcoin, whatever that Satoshi count. Okay, cool. It's kind of like the elites we have now, and just the average American with the wealth gap we've seen over COVID. So it's with you, I've seen some stuff from Balaji. He's a really smart dude. I remember I had to ask you before we started because the last week's been so chaotic. I could have sworn he tweeted that like 2 weeks ago, and you said it was like last week because shit's been so
Five
crazy.
days. It's just
Yeah,
5 days.
it's that's my just first impression of it. Like when he said hyperinflation in a million, and I'm just like, okay, is he thinking about like from A to Z? Because same thing, Twitter is definitely at times not the best environment to have an intellectual discussion. But when I saw that too, and we were chatting at the meetup on Sunday, the first thing I was thinking, I'm like, even to your point, if we hit 100K, like, yeah, that might seem cool, but if that train keeps rolling, it's like, okay, if this keeps going up, how's it actually going to affect the 99.99% of Americans who still aren't in this? And then like I said, if we did hit $1 million, it's like, basically we can make a lot of enemies all of a sudden because same thing, people are like, oh, you guys already have a ton of this shit, we got to still wait for the, what is it, 2 million Bitcoin that still need to get mined. But I think even though we talk about this a lot too, and I find myself doing this. I think one issue in Bitcoin right now over the last 2 years of fund money, just helicopter bullshit, we assume that the price of Bitcoin validates its stability or success. And to a degree, that's true. But it's like, same thing, last 12 months we've been going down, but the network's gotten bigger, the hash rate's gone up, blah, 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 which you could argue is actually more important because that's where the real value of the decentralization is. So I was kind of like you too, and I guess to wrap up on this, like even if he was wrong, like it's kind of like Plan B, stock to flow. Like a lot of people in our group and on the Twitter, when we only hit 60K twice, they're like, "Oh, Plan B was wrong," blah blah blah. And I was like, "Well, he said we were going to go to 200. If we went to $400,000, no one would have been bitching." And that's what you just said too. I kind of found it funny how he hit $1 million because I'm like, he either believes that or on the off chance, like you said, he's doing this for likes. But even if he said we're going to hit $100,000, if we don't hit it, everyone's going to say he's a fool. But if we hit 150, not a single soul would be bitching. So that's what I'm more curious to see. It's like, even if we like God forbid somehow hit $100,000 in 90 days, everyone's gonna be laughing at him like he's a fool. And that's what I was thinking. I'm like, I wonder if he's doing like a weird public reverse psychology experiment. Like he thinks we're gonna hit 100K. He says $1 million. We hit the 100K, and then he just basically shows everyone like, we literally just did a 5-bagger in like 90 calendar days, you dumbasses. Like this was my whole point. So it's Yeah, it was just a whole weird thing. But the biggest thing that concerned me was just like $1 million in hyperinflation. I'm like, if either of those two things happen in the next 90 days, we're going Mad Max. So I'm like you, I'm a pretty sober person, but when I saw that and just saw the Twitter circles going, I was like, oh boy, this could get hairy quick.
Yeah, one way of thinking about it is he is saying that the banks are insolvent. They don't have our money. The Fed knew about it all along because he found some Fed report, and um one of the sort of references, things that they just kind of put at the bottom, footnotes. That's the word I was trying to get at. One of the footnotes was saying that we now understand that only about 5% of the banks in the United States are actually capitalized, in a safe way. So 95% are not, right? And this was like last year. So he said that, and he actually tweeted a picture of that footnote, and he says, well, the Fed already knew the banks were bankrupt, a year ago, and they never told us, right? And so don't they have some responsibility to like tell depositors that, hey, your money is actually, when you put money in a bank, you're basically just lending it out to someone who just loans it out on leverage. And then when the market collapses, it goes down because interest rates or whatever, well, all that leverage is just going to deleverage and you're left holding the bag. And if the government is not going to let depositors lose their money, that means that the Fed just has to like print money out of thin air to be able to plug that hole. But the real evil here is the banking sector is just set up in this fractional reserve system that is just designed to ultimately extract value from the monetary dollar system. It only works if every now and then you just devalue the dollar massively in order to be able to make the system work. And unfortunately, this cycle occurred in 2008. And then the money printer just been going on since COVID. And here we are again at yet another third junction in the last 15 years where the spigot of money printing has to be turned on. And at this time, it's like a dam that you just like open it up and there's just floodgates coming out. And we're living in a digital world where information is traveling very fast, and information, as we've said many times in this podcast, information too is decentralized now and decentralizing. And if you want information, you're no longer turning to CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or anybody. You're going on Twitter and you're following some people you trust. Now, Twitter is full of crazy people, but it's also full of very smart people. So what you get out of Twitter is literally, the people you decide to listen to. You curate the content for yourself. And there's many people who are doing this, and there's many people with capital who's doing this. I think what he's saying is in the face of all of these facts, there's going to be enough people who realize that the dollar system is getting devalued again. But this time we have an alternative place to put our assets into, and all of that economic energy, when it is moved to a monetary system that is scarce, and you can't just print more because that's just not how it works. And there's no counterparty risk. It offers two things that the current US monetary system does not offer. And because we live in a digital age where things can go from 0 to 1 super fast, because money now moves and capital moves at the speed of the internet, we can go from the 25K to the $1 million within weeks. That because capital just moves that fast. And he did have an interesting point, and a lot of people have been talking about this on news channels and on blogs and Twitter spaces as well, is one of the main reasons, I mean, there's many reasons that Silicon Valley collapsed, but one of the reasons was that they had withdrawals in one day equaling $42 billion, which was, I think, 25% of their entire like deposit base. Now, even JP Morgan cannot sustain 25% of their deposit base leaving in one day, right? I mean, no matter how big you are, you just can't sustain that. So that was one of the reasons that they collapsed as well. And that is a direct function of the internet age that we're living in. And that dynamic applies to Bitcoin as well. I mean, what is more digital than Bitcoin, right? You can just go on any sort of exchange in the world. You can buy USDC. I mean, the slowest friction is this getting the money to exchanges so you can convert it over to Bitcoin. But once that's done, I mean, that itself doesn't take that long, right? I mean, if it's a wire, it takes as much as 3 days. It really depends on your jurisdiction. There's a lot of people, for example, that are sitting on USDT or USDC. There's billions of dollars locked in those assets. They can be moved into Bitcoin in far more liquid ways. And it's not going to take much. It's not going to take it's not going to take $1 trillion of fiat moving into Bitcoin to get it to $1 million. The market is very thin. It's very illiquid when you're faced with that amount of capital infusion. I mean, I would think that if a mere 10 billion or 20 billion dollars, of fiat was moved into the Bitcoin monetary network, it would make the price go up 4x. Like the people say, listen, I don't know what the dollar is doing, but there's this other asset that has no counterparty risk, and I can self-custody it myself, and it's scarce, and no one's going to rehypothecate it and lose this money for me. I'm just going to go ahead and buy it just in case. And if large hedge funds do this, then you don't want to be the first, but you don't want to be the last either, right? So Balaji, I think, is raising this sort of thing and pointing out to everybody that, listen, a massive dollar devalue is occurring. Let's remind ourselves that we have Bitcoin and it was invented exactly for this. And I think the bet he's making is not necessarily it's going to be a million in 30 days. Maybe it's 100,000 in 6 months. That's still great, right? It's still, and if it does happen in the middle of a banking crisis, the narrative will shift completely about what Bitcoin is. It's not store of value. It's not like medium of exchange. It's not any of those things. It's basically just a asset class that has no counterparty risk, that is scarce. And you do with that properties what you will, but the bet is that there's a lot of people with financial economic energy that is going to move that economic energy into the Bitcoin monetary system because they see that the other monetary system is basically just a bag of air that's losing steam. And before they see their dollar value collapse in that monetary system, they just want to move it over to a much harder asset that has been around for 15 years and has had 100% uptime for a decade, despite all of the scandals and despite all of the ups and downs and price fluctuations. It's still directionally up and to the right. So I think that's the bet he's making. I think the number and the time frame are less important than him just pointing out that if you want to protect your economic energy, there's an option now that's been around for over a decade that we know works. And if it wasn't for the Fed, just bringing trillions of dollars of liquidity back into the markets here in the next few weeks, we wouldn't need it as much, right? But we are in this mess. The people who are in control of the dollar monetary system have abdicated the responsibility for maintaining the security of it and maintaining the purchasing power of it. And they have been poor stewards of that monetary policy. You can't just fuck around with it and just expect it to work as normal, right? You have to treat it delicately because these things have to be treated delicately. You can't just fuck around with money. It's that thing. You fuck around and you find out,
Find
right?
out, yeah.
And we're finding out now.
I guess one thing, Sunday at the meetup, I know we were kind of joking, but everyone sat down. I went and got another beer, and then you pat me on the back. You're like, "Hey, how you doing? We're catching up." You're like, "Yeah, sorry." I'm like, "What?" You're like, "10K Bitcoin ain't happening." And we went down the rabbit hole on that. Like everything you said, I think is like a really good primer, kind of just for how. Like I said when we first kind of started, like just we're in uncharted waters right now, and that's kind of the problem with this stuff is we've talked about this ad nauseum. It's like end of the day, what is money and what is the economy? It's kind of a subsection of psychology. Like mathematically prove to me a $1 or $100 bill is 100x a $1 bill. You can't do it, And I think we've talked about this too. One thing I found with COVID, obviously there was a lot of enforcement, but even some people that maybe the state didn't enforce stuff, their whatever nation or area they were in didn't enforce it down on it. But COVID showed a lot of people rather be controlled than free. A lot of people, even in Texas, they bitch on that libertarian thing. Oh, secede, it's like don't tread on me, blah blah blah. But when a push comes to shove, it's like if you're your own everything, and then shit hits the fan, it gets really hairy quick. So the reason I bring that up is like we said, we've almost had 15 years, like what would almost be a legal adult if it was the fund money helicopter policy was a human. We've had it for 15 years, and the markets, and like we just said, even Kashkari, I don't know if you follow him. I believe he's the president of the Minnesota Fed. He's been very vocal recently. He was actually part of that documentary I told you I was watching. He
Mm.
basically he said, the Fed's not going to take credit for anything that's done. We only step in when we feel like it's need to. And James Jacoby goes, "Oh, so you think it's necessary to step in for 15 years?" And he's quiet for like 10 seconds because you've trained the markets. I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but he actually almost looks like Warren Buffett. He's like one of the best bond investors ever, and that documentary said that the problem the Fed has done, it's not even the injection of the money, which is the problem, but it's the psychology. He said, we have trained markets for 15 years that if you make an investment and you win, you're on your own. You get to keep the profits. But if you lose, the Fed will bend every rule, every dollar they can get their hands on to bail your ass out. And this is my question to you. It's like we just said, everyone's like, okay, the money printing's kind of tapering or quantitative tightening. It looks like this might be behind us. And then last month we've had, these 3, 4 banks blow up. And like you said, it seems like the burr's, back on full throttle. So, do you think the average, how do I word this? Do you think it's going to be the legacy financial system, like the last 15 years has been affected by this money printing, that they might look at Bitcoin as alternative, and we have that in the next 6, 12 months, that delta? Or do you think it's going to be like the average person that's like, these idiots in DC, or whether they're in Europe or whatever, they're not looking out for me, they're looking out for their buddies in the 1% in the stock market? So where do you think that delta is going to come from? Because obviously, like you said, we're going to need 20, 50, $100 billion. But do you think I guess my bow with this is, do you think for now the legacy financial system is just so in a trance from the last 15 years of easy money that delta, that mass adoption at this point in the next 12, 24 months has to come from the average person? Or do you still think there's enough people on Wall Street, wherever, they're like, okay, actually the Fed's drunk right now, I'm gonna maybe not 50%, put 10% of my my VC or my portfolio into this Bitcoin thing because it's like it's been kicking for 15 years and it has more brain cells than the Fed? What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. My instinct is, for what it's worth, right, is that we are heading towards an inflection point where the whole 0 to 1 thing that Balaji talks about is, about to be crystallized. And by that I mean, for example, while all of this was happening, the bank runs and everything. I don't know if you heard the news, but Fidelity opened up Bitcoin and Ethereum, trading to 37 million of its customers, retail
I did not hear that.
customers.
Okay, nice.
All right, so that's Fidelity, right? So that's like one of the biggest
Blue chip, yeah.
blue chip asset custodians in the entire world. This has happened like a week ago or 10 days ago. So what I am thinking may happen is that in the next 90 days or 6 months or whatever, there's going to be enough layman people and enough institutional people to slowly start creeping towards Bitcoin, to where you just start to develop this critical mass of people saying, okay, now we get it. We understand this is a non-sovereign, scarce resource with no counterparty risk. And Bitcoin has always had no counterparty risk, but it's only now that you realize how important that quality was as well, right? I mean, Bitcoin could not be scarce. Maybe they've been part of the protocol. It just keeps inflating away at some acceptable rate. Bitcoin might not be, self-custodial or something, right? Uh, but this non-counterparty risk thing suddenly seems to be the most important thing about Bitcoin. So what I'm getting at is that I'm hoping, praying, hypothesizing that what may happen this year, I'm not, I don't know about the time frames, is that it gets to a certain price point after having gone through all of this bear market and everyone's calling it dead and it's died again and Bitcoin is a pet rock and it doesn't do anything. But all of this stuff we saw in 2021 about people just shitting all over it in 2022 as well. If it comes back and some big hedge fund says, yes, we get it, no counterparty risk, a message received. Now, when we put wealth into Bitcoin, at least we know the bank is not going to just play funny money with it and lose it all for us, right? At least we know that. Yes, maybe the price will come up and down, whatever. So one person does this, then another institution does this, and another does this, and it reaches a critical mass where the institutions don't want to be the last one in the door, and then it's just a game theory dynamic. It's like, okay, if enough large players decide that it's a thing, then that's what makes it a thing. The thing, what makes it a thing is if economic energy goes into it, right? And economic energy right now is captured mostly in US dollars and so or and other fiat currencies. So if there's enough of that economic energy that moves into Bitcoin in the next year because of this banking crisis and because it's exceedingly obvious to not just Americans but every country in the world is looking at their governments and their central banks like, you fuckwads don't know what the hell you're doing at all. I mean, you're completely incompetent, and that's been clear ever since COVID happened. So now we're also going to trust you with monetary policy. Okay, you probably still are going to have your finger on the pulse of your own monetary policy, but God damn it, if I'm not going to take some insurance out on this, just in the case that you continue to dilute it further, and it just so happens that there is finally now an instrument where that insurance can be taken in the form of Bitcoin. So it could be just like Balaji says, slowly then suddenly, you 0 to 1 very fast, and that too because money is now moving at a speed of the internet. And as a result of that, you could go from that 0 to 1 very fast. So I do think that there will be some sort of again, this is all speculation, and this is, what Bitcoin people have been talking about for years. And it seems like the environment has given Bitcoin the opportunity to finally be what it was meant to be, right? Totally scarce, non-sovereign, hard monetary network with no counterparty risk. That's always, it was that from day one, right? And now the utility of all of these properties are becoming incredibly obvious to any person with two brain cells to put together who understands the banking crisis and why it's happened and what central banks had to do, what role they played in loose monetary policy and what are not just, the feds, our politicians. Biden just put up another $6 trillion budget, and it's going to run up a deficit of like $1 trillion in just 1 year, right? It is like casual, like, hey, another $1 trillion, please.
Yeah, I'm about to say at this point it's water under the bridge, right? It's it's like 3% of our debt or whatever the hell now.
Yeah, so I mean, they're not even having conversations about, oh, we probably should do something about the budget deficit, right? Is no, let's just make more money, right? Let's just print some more. And then the Fed created the BTFP program that's going to allow a whole bunch of liquidity to come in. And then just today, that alone, the BTFP program allowed potentially $4.4 trillion of liquidity to come out of these mortgage-backed securities and these treasuries that are underwater. That would potentially unlock as much as $4.4 trillion. All right. So maybe it's not even that much that's unlocked. Maybe it's 25% of that. So only $1 trillion then is unlocked, right? And I don't know what it is today, but just a few days ago, the amount of money that was unlocked through that mechanism was $150 billion in 4 days. And so there's no doubt by the end of this week, we'll probably be at $1 trillion because First Republic Bank is still being bank run. Anyway, so while we were all like, looking in amazement at how much money was going to come out of the BTFP program, Janet Yellen finally said today, after saying that the banking system is completely stable, and after just testifying a week ago that she sees no systemic risk to the financial system, and after testifying a few years ago that I don't see any financial crisis occurring during my lifetime, after saying all of those things, she said today that the U.S. is studying ways to back up every single depositor in every single bank in the U.S. Right, and that's going to take, where's that money coming from? Right? It's going to come from the infinite money machine, right? That is the U.S. Fed. They're coming up with some, voodoo accounting trick, right? And that means the banks are yet again bailed out, right? You can do risky bullshit things. You can, you may have to behave yourself for 2 or 3 years, but give it enough time. Another president will come that will roll back regulations, and then the banks will take crazy risks again. They will they'll bail out. Maybe it'll happen in 5 years or 10 years. But the system is now cooked, right? It's rinse and repeat. This is just going to keep happening. You would have thought that, okay, $1 trillion during the great financial crisis, that was such a big deal back then. It was about $800 billion, right? It was considered such a giant deal. Like, are you guys crazy? That's like so much money. What's wrong with you? And now, like, casually, the budget has that much of a deficit.
It's the daily operation, basically at this point.
So in the face of all of that, like, I can understand like Balaji's contention here. Like, I think people don't want to take it that seriously because they're like, well, if we have hyperinflation, then we have a Mad Max world. Then you go to the grocery stores and eggs are $400. I really don't want that world at all.
No.
I'm for the sake of the stability of the society that I live in the United States, I do not want that outcome because if the U.S. is in that position, we're going to be in this position everywhere throughout the world.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter if I have Bitcoin or you have Bitcoin. I don't want the world to be in such like a destitute way because not everyone's going to buy the Bitcoin thing, right? Most of humanity is going to be outside of the Bitcoin standard, and then only the people who bought in early are beneficiaries. And then you have a whole other sort of wealth dynamic that's very dangerous for society as well. So it's almost like, Bitcoin is a lifeboat because the Titanic is sinking.
Hmm.
But just because you're in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in freezing waters and you're on the lifeboat doesn't mean you're in a great situation. Yes, you
Hmm.
got the lifeboat, but you're still in the middle of the fucking ocean in the middle of nowhere. Well, it's still not a good situation to be in. It's better than being underwater, that's for sure. But you would rather the Titanic didn't crash to begin with, right? You would rather that system continued the way it was. So that's why I started off by saying I really do think we're living through like historic times that people are going to be talking about for a long time, and the situation isn't yet like clear. Like we don't know what's going to happen. The Fed meeting is tomorrow, and First Republic Bank is still it's a big mess. UBS just bought Credit Suisse, a bank that was 166 years old. Man, it's even older than Warren Buffett. Or
Yeah,
Charlie Munger.
yeah, that's saying something. Yeah.
So yeah, man, I feel a bit perturbed and a bit like scared to be honest. Like it scares me to think that these things may happen. I don't know, man. I mean, do you see the banking sector stabilizing over the next 10 days? I mean, we're talking about days because we can't keep doing this for
No,
like a month, right?
yeah. It. I mean, it goes back to my thing, man. It's on when we were talking at the meetup, I still think we haven't. And same thing. Like I know we were talking with Balaji about being terms. Obviously, if you're looking for something, it's not a black swan event by definition. But it's like I just still think there's just not enough pain out there. I just think people are still the average people, these idiots in D.C., New York, Wall Street, just all of it together, man. I think they just still think the Fed is just omniscient God and they can just keep kicking the can down the road. And what you just said, it's like, in '08, people were like, oh my God, we just spent $800 billion. Like, this is ludicrous. And we basically just did 7 trillion. So let's just basically call it a 10x. And that was like a decade difference. So if this happens, let's just do math right now. At the end of the decade, let's say in 2032, what's it going to be? 50 trillion, 70 trillion? And like, a lot of people listening at home, I assume know this, but we talk about this too at the meetups on end, just over text. Like the only thing that's really keeping America going right now is for some reason the rest of the world, well, not for some reason, but they still convince themselves that the U.S. dollar has value. But it's like we don't really make anything here. And like I told you, I saw that one interview with I'm forgetting the gentleman's name right now, but and Peter Schiff, and they were talking about America China war. And that just goes to my thing. It's like, I still think people, like you said, think that like Mad Max is some Narnia fantasy thing that's 100 years out and we can keep this going. And that goes back to my point I was saying on Sunday. I just still think there's not enough pain, and whatever that black swan event thing is going to be, I just still don't think it, because like I told you, this past weekend I was in San Antonio for powerlifting meet, and one thing I like about Austin, there's a really healthy powerlifting scene here. A lot of people know each other. It's a small community, kind of like our crypto groups, good people. And even in San Antonio, the owner of my gym knew that gym, so he was kind of hyping me up, talking some shit for me. And same thing too. They're like, oh yeah, Tommy was telling me you're one of these crazy Bitcoin guys. So I'm talking to the owners of the gym and some people, give them like my 90-second thing. And then right afterwards, we're like talking squat form because they're like they're to meet. They're not worried about hyperinflation and
Right.
UBS blowing up and all that shit. But same thing, when we were in the middle of '08, I feel like everyone and their dog was talking about it. And that's the thing. It's like I think people saw after '08, the Fed stepped in. After COVID, the Fed stepped in. And this goes back to our psychology point. I just think we're still conditioned. It's I mean, your Titanic analogy is perfect. Even if this Bitcoin thing works, we're in the middle of the ocean. It's 30-degree water, and so like we're safe, but we're not safe. But
Right.
to your point, that was a great analogy. The Titanic was unsinkable until it wasn't. And that's the thing. I
Yeah,
think
that's
the
right.
Fed is an iron fortress until it's not.
Mm,
And I guess to answer your question, is just like you said, like we can't even look out months right now, days. But it's like I just think everything is so teetering right now. The Fed's gonna keep doing the Fed put until they literally can't put down no more. Whether that's they just don't have any resources or any more ammunition behind them, or the U.S. population or the global economy just stops taking this Ponzi scheme we've been doing. But it's like you said, it's so hard to tell because you to figure that out, you have to look out weeks and months. And like you said, in the last 10 days, it's felt like a month just from the never ending. The last month's felt like a year because we've had what 4 or 5 banks blow up now. It's like when does it end? And that's like you said, that's the hard part is to figure that out. You kind of have to look out months, but most people we can't we can't even look out 10 days now because shit's so crazy.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true that a lot of people have lost confidence in the banking sector. I think Silicon Valley has made it very clear to people that the banks are basically leveraged to the tits, and with interest rates, the tide went out, and all of these banks were swimming naked, as to use the famous Warren Buffett analogy.
Yep.
And you can't unsee that, right? You can't unsee the fact that these banks are all essentially bankrupt. And if you have any kind of business in some regional bank, you're like, well, why would I risk it, right? And the only way that you stop the bank runs is for the U.S. government to say we will backstop every single depositor. That's the only way you're going to be able to do it. We went from the Fed will make the Fed will create a BTFP program to the private banks, J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs. They basically did helicopter money to First Republic Bank, and we went from that to the Janet Yellen saying that okay, we're just going to make sure all depositors are, secure. And whatever you do, that the only solution is that you're going to have to make money materialize from somewhere. Then that just means money printing, whether you want to call it the BFTP program, you want to call it, whatever bullshit loans, you want to call it a buyout. I mean, whatever you want to call it, right? The only way to fix the fact that money has been lost is you got to just put more money into the system, right? And that just means a more devaluation. So during COVID, Arthur Hayes pointed this out in his Medium article recently. The Fed printed about $4 trillion. Okay, 4 trillion is what they printed, and this time the amount of depositor money that the Fed, the U.S. is saying that they're going to guarantee is about $17 trillion, right? And the amount of securities that are underwater that the banks can take collateral against, that's about $4 trillion. So where does this end, right? And last time they printed $4 trillion, Bitcoin went from $3,000 to $69,000, right? So it did like a 25x. It's starting out at $25,000 today, right? I mean, whatever it is now, 26, 27.
Yeah, 25, yeah.
Yeah, it started at 25 when all these shenanigans were going on. And so if it does a 20x from here, then it basically will solidify Bitcoin's role in place as an alternative monetary network to the US dollar. And it's hard to see. It's sort of like you're looking at all the pieces on the chessboard, and you can see that you're about to get checkmated. And you are like, okay, how do I get myself out of? There must be a way, right? But
Yeah.
you can see checkmate in 3 moves. You can see there's no way to escape, right? And that's how I kind of feel. It's very difficult for me to like get around Balaji's logic and the fact that he makes the points that he does make. And even though it just seems unthinkable, the last time he came up with this big fire alarm was with COVID, and the things he was saying back then were unthinkable also, but they all happened, right? COVID is definitely the most impactful thing to happen in our lifetimes, right? The last time, not even 9/11 was as big as that.
Oh
right?
yeah, no,
as,
not even
as
yeah.
COVID. Yeah, so because it was just like a slow moving train wreck. Like 9/11 happened, and then it was done, right? It happened in one day, in a few hours, right? And then there was a fallout from it and everything, and the reaction to it. But the COVID was just a slow moving train wreck,
Yeah.
for like 2 years, right? And that's the last time that he raised such a big fire alarm. And it could be that this is also something that plays out over the next year, not 90 days, but he may be directionally completely correct. And he may later say that in the next 3 months, after Bitcoin is not a million, but maybe it's 100,000, which is only 4x from here, right? I mean, 4x now doesn't seem like a long a big thing to climb if everyone is getting on the Bitcoin a Bitcoin lifeboat. How much are you going to want to pay for a lifeboat when your Titanic sinks? Right? It's you're willing to pay a lot, to preserve your capital. 25,000 seems cheap for a lifeboat right now, right? And if you're like a hedge fund who has $10 billion under management or $100 billion under management, and you want to just protect a little bit of that, just 1% of that, you're like, this kind of makes sense. It's I think Chamath Palihapitiya called Bitcoin schmuck insurance. Is that in the event that the system breaks down and just the Fed destroys us all, and our stupid politicians run the monetary network into a ground, then Bitcoin is your schmuck insurance. And he says you better hope you don't need it, right? Because if you need it, it means the society has really
Yeah.
messed things up. And now you are forced to use an alternative system that the politicians cannot really control. One of the things that Balaji pointed out as well is that they were trying to block the exits. Because if you think about Bitcoin as the exit, right? If you buy stocks, for example, right? Okay, I'm going to hedge against this hyperinflation because I'm going to buy Apple stock, right? You're still in the fiat system. You've just put your money in, and you just taken money out of your bank account and put it into another brokerage account, and have bought property in another this company that is also running on the fiat system. So, when you just allocate your money around to gold, or paper gold, I mean, or to stocks, or to ETFs, or to mutual funds, or to whatever, you're basically just moving the decks around on that Titanic, ship, right? To keep using the analogy, you're just moving the deck chairs around. You haven't actually gotten off the ship, whereas Bitcoin allows you to get off the ship before it sinks, right? And to be securely on the lifeboat. And so I think that's what he's trying to do, is he's trying to say, listen, the ship is sinking, it has hit the iceberg, and there are these lifeboats that right now are only going for $25,000 a pop. And they're going to get really expensive if you wait too long to get on the lifeboat. So I think he may be, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough people believe that's the case, then that it'll be self-realized, because all you need is just more capital to go in. And if you're a high conviction person and you put all your capital, or a large part of your capital, into this thing, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if enough people do it. So to some extent, maybe he's trying to engineer this to happen. Maybe it would have happened anyway. I don't know. It's one of those things where it's you can't really understand. You can't really know if it would have happened anyway, or he's just pointing out that, listen, this is perfectly placed for you. We basically teed you up here. Bitcoin has been around for 10 years, has proven itself, and in the last 10 years, the banks have, and the Fed have completely debased the dollar. And let's remind ourselves that on the Genesis block on Bitcoin, the first words were, Chancellor on the brink of a second bailout for banks. Right now, we're on the midst of a third bailout right now. Right, the BTFP was the second one, right, and now Janet Yellen saying everyone is safe. Right, that's the third one. That's the third bailout. So it's ironic, right, that it's a banking crisis that led us to this situation to begin with, right? Or maybe it's not ironic. Maybe this was, meant to happen all along, right? So I don't know, man. That's sort of my 2 cents on this thing. It's something that has really taken over my brain. I've been thinking about nothing else, like reading a whole bunch of stuff and listening to Balaji and being on Twitter. I'm exhausted, honestly, man. I need to take I feel like I need to take a break. This banking crisis has really like captivated my attention in the last 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, I know I said this before, but one thing I do like about the group, obviously, I try to keep social media limited because, as we all know, even if on Twitter I follow the Matt Taibbi's and Greenwald's professionals, but even then, it's like if they post something and you go in the comments, you just read, like you said, you can just eat your brain juice and just go Alex Jones crazy in 2 hours. But even as much as I try to keep up in the space, one thing besides just talking with people and being like, okay, I'm not crazy, every person in our group kind of has like their own little tap they keep on in the finance sector. Kat is more, she works for a crypto company, and even though she's kind of in the space, she's more of like a curious mindset. Rob and Chris are kind of like our Doombergs of the group. Sanat, Isaac, the guys, Jacob that work in the tech sector, they keep up with that. And then you have like some kind of more normies like me and Carl. I mean, obviously you're in the medical field, but obviously the tech side of it you don't touch as much, and that's one thing I love about our group because like if it wasn't for our group, dude, I don't know if I could keep up with this shit on my own. Because like you said, dude, it's just like drinking from a water hose, and it's kind of a double edged
Yeah.
sword. I find myself like even over COVID with everything that was transpiring. It's like I want to be informed, but also like we said, it's like the legacy media and even like Twitter, as good as some of the independent journalists are, it's just it can just fucking plague your mind, man. It's a double edged sword. So yeah, like that's like one thing I just like hammer home to like some of my normie friends. Like, man, you guys are always going to these crypto meetups. I'm like, if it wasn't for these other crazy 20 people, I'd lose my fucking mind going on like CNN and Twitter all day trying to figure out like what the hell is going on with Credit Suisse, what the hell is like a swap, you know? So that's like the only saving grace, man. I hear you.
No, man, I've taken so much out of the group myself, like it's given me so much, like we've turned into like a core group of people, that meet pretty regularly, and it's been expanding, there's like 600 members of the group right now. And in a bear market we still have some pretty good turnout. So yeah, man, I'm super psyched about keeping it going as well. And like you said, I mean, there's a lot of like varied perspectives as well. I do know when I went there, yeah, the other day when I was meeting you guys, I told you I flipped bullish for the price of Bitcoin at least right
Yeah, I
now.
was surprised. Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of surprised myself. I sat on the idea for a few days, and again, like it's a bittersweet thing to have this mindset, right? Because it is in the context of this banking crisis and the fact that Bitcoin's price will probably be going up, not because, things are going well, because things are not going well,
Yeah.
right? And that's just not like, that doesn't sit easy with me at all. It doesn't make me happy, right? Like, if the US was like just, killing it and, we were all doing great and everyone was doing great and Bitcoin was also doing great, I would have much preferred that outcome, right? I don't want Bitcoin to be the lifeboat when this Titanic sinks because I'd rather not the Titanic sink at all,
Yeah.
right? The Titanic, lots of people died on the Titanic, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's unfortunately looking like that's kind of what may be happening. One of the, a couple of other things, speaking of drinking from a fire hose, that I just want to point out are also happening in the last, that have been happening in the last few weeks is Hong Kong has opened up its trading for cryptocurrency that's going to start in June. It's an officially announced, right? And just remember, Hong Kong is still not under the control of the Chinese government. So this is essentially the Chinese government saying that, okay, at least in Hong Kong, you can, if you want to, buy and sell cryptocurrency because it's not illegal in China at all, right? So you have a bunch of crypto exchanges that are now going back to set up camp in Hong Kong, and the idea is that if it does well in Hong Kong and it's orderly and all that other stuff, then there's a chance that China may allow for cryptocurrency to be traded as well. Now, I think about the game theory of this as well is the Chinese doing this because they want to themselves, like the government themselves wants to have some Bitcoin exposure. And the reason I say this, now I'm putting my foil hat on, so the things that I'm going to say have to be taken with a grain of salt. I'm not making any bold assertions. I'm just like noticing things. So I noticed that happen. Then President Xi of China goes to Russia. He was
Yeah,
there
I
just
saw
the other
that.
day. And he's like, we have to sort of like, strengthen our relationships. And, this is the first country President Xi went to after he got reelected. This was his first foreign trip. And then they also came up with some sort of a ceasefire proposal that Russia said they would be open to discussing, and which the Ukrainians also said, they did not poo-poo it at all. They're like, well, we would also be open to thinking about it, right? And in the midst of this, by the way, even though Ukraine is a free country, apparently, the United States weighed in and says, well, that would be unacceptable.
I
All
wonder
right.
why.
Anyway, while that is also happening, Saudi Arabia and Iran have agreed to reestablish relations with each other. The reason this is significant is because that breakthrough, and breakthrough is really the word for it, in their reestablishing relationships was brokered by none other than the Chinese. So you have Iran and Saudi Arabia, Russia, um, who are some of the biggest producers of oil in the world, all kind of, I wouldn't say cozying up to China, but having far more productive kind of level of conversations with China than they are with the United States at this point. Right, because I can promise you, Saudi Arabia is sick and tired of the United States. Iran is definitely sick and tired of the United States, and I don't have to tell you about the feelings of Russia and China towards the United States. And if you combine the fact that these are countries with large amounts of oil and capital, who are sick and tired of not just the United States financial sort of aggression, but also the fact that they have suffered from having to use its monetary policy. It is not outside the bound of possibility that, if Bitcoin gets to some sort of a market cap, like 10 trillion or whatever, right? If let's say it goes to $1 million, then it is suddenly now a viable global reserve currency that they can use. They're like, okay, fuck the United States. Bitcoin has reached this value. I'm not saying they will make it go up to that value. I'm saying once it's there, they're like, hey, why don't we just settle, oil in Bitcoin from now on, right? Like we'll just sell it once a month or whatever, because the market cap is large enough to be able to now contain global trade. So I'm sure that there's smart people in those countries that are looking at Bitcoin from this angle as well. Right now, of course, the market cap is not large enough to be able to do that kind of thing. But they could also force the issue. I mean, Saudi Arabia could come up tomorrow and said, you know what, we actually are going to invest in Bitcoin miners because we have a lot of solar energy that hits our land. We have a lot of carbon energy that we have under the ground. We have a lot of trapped, energy in oil fields that, we can't really tap. So we're just going to use those to create, Bitcoin with miners. Russia has a ton of cheap oil as well that they can also do for the same purposes as well. China is now opening up trading for cryptocurrency. So I'm seeing some of these Lego pieces moving in a way where Bitcoin is just getting stronger, not weaker. And it does. And if you asked me 3 weeks ago, what is my biggest concern about crypto? It's regulatory concerns. Like, the SEC is going to kill crypto. The blah 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 is going to Biden is going to do something. Now I'm like, it may be this may be too big for them. Like they can try to ban Bitcoin tomorrow, but what if China and and Hong Kong and China, Saudi Arabia, Russia all decide, hey, you know what, we're actually going to start transacting. I mean, it's still going to go up to $1 million if they decide to do that.
And it'd be a death sentence for the U.S. too. Like you're the last one out the door, like you said, it'd be hangman.
And not only that, but even Gary Gensler said, yeah, everything Bitcoin is a security. So he's already multiple times made that claim. And, how are you going to ban it? I mean, you can't now, right? There's no office to raid. There's no one to arrest. You can ban Bitcoin mining, but good luck doing that in Texas, right? Which has the highest hash rate, by the way, of any state in the United States is in Texas. There's a lot of pro-Bitcoin people in Texas. Mm-hmm. So, you can try on a federal level to ban it. Texas is not going to listen. Texas is going to be like, come and get our miners.
Come and take it, yep.
Yeah, come and take it, right? So you can't even ban it, right? And so if you're stuck with it and you can't ban it, and you've already said it's not a security, I think Bitcoin, there's nothing standing in the way of, a great amount of monetary energy. And Saylor talks about Bitcoin as basically monetary energy, right? And I think that's very apt, right? So all money really is trapped potential energy that leverages economic activity, right? And so if you think about it in energy terms, the $1 million question, and no pun intended, but the $1 million question for 2023 in the face of these banking crises is a great deal of that monetary energy going to move from the dollar system and go into the Bitcoin system. That's the correct way of framing that conversation, right? And you have the demise of the U.S. monetary network that bolsters that case. And you have the fact that countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China are seeming to want to move away from the dollar hegemony. Because as you well know, when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the things that the United States government did is it froze, and the EU is guilty of this as well, it froze all of the deposits the Russian central bank had in their European banks. I don't know if you know that. So the Russian central bank had about $600 billion of deposits held in banks in Europe. And when the invasion happened, the European bank says, well, this money doesn't belong to you anymore. That's $600 billion that they just took. And they were able to get away with that because they control the monetary network. So if you are China and you see that happening, what are you going to think about? Well, actually, using this network actually makes me really vulnerable. So maybe we should come up with some sort of, maybe we should set the stage for alternatives here, right? So if there is a Ukrainian Russian rapprochement because of China's efforts, that they settle a peace deal, whatever. If Iran and Saudi Arabia bury the hatchet and China mediates that as well in the next 12 months, that alone is phenomenal evidence that the U.S. is basically losing its
Grounding, yeah.
influence in the world stage. And I think the next thing that will happen after that is countries are going to look for alternatives to the dollar monetary network. And if Bitcoin gets to a dollar cap large enough, it will probably hit a critical mass where countries will seize on the. If it hits $100,000, right? Maybe Saudi Arabia waits until it gets to $150,000 and it says, okay, we're also buying it at 150. And every time it gets below 150, we're just going to buy more, right? Because they have infinite amount of money. They have so much oil.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, they could easily just keep the price propped up, right? Nothing's going to stop them from being able to do that. You could have all the sell pressure in the world, but if countries get behind it, there's no way it's coming down to $10,000 or whatever it is, right? It's like, okay, this is now an international global reserve currency that can be used to transact internationally. It can be used to transact, commodities as well. There will be some sort of a unit of account thing that has to happen, like we have to figure out how to price things, because if we're not pricing it in dollars, then what are we pricing it? Are we pricing it to a barrel of oil? Because that's how the dollar is priced, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of tied to the oil price. So maybe they'll come up with some sort of a pricing mechanism for. It'll probably be priced on the cost to mine Bitcoin will probably be the basis. I think there'll be some basis there. So this is how much it costs to mine. And so based on how much it costs, how much energy, how much oil you need to burn to generate turbines to mine a Bitcoin, that'll be the base cost, right? And then anything above that is just driven by supply and demand. I'm just making shit up here, but maybe that's how you start pricing it. And then that would be connected to the price of oil. And again, I'm just making that up. But there's that saying that there are centuries where nothing there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are days when decades happen, right? And it really feels like the last 3 weeks are definitely maybe I'm just drinking from the Kool-Aid too much, but I don't know, man. I also have like instincts about things, and my spidey sense is going off that this is really very transformational times we're living in. Me and you, we've lived through too much history for our lifetimes. I would really love the next 30 years to be very boring, but I don't think we're gonna get that.
Yeah, boy can dream, right?
There's a saying in Chinese. There's an ancient Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times," because when times are interesting, and they're also very stressful too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess like to comment on everything. I mean, no, that was a good thread rant, man, because I don't even think it's as tinfoil hatty as you think. I always tell people one thing, and even in Austin, there's a lot of Bitcoin, seeing Bitcoin maxis, and I'm actually not the biggest fan of them because I think they're very naive, for lack of a better word. Jordan Peterson talks about this with the technology because he's had some comments on Bitcoin. He's like, the biggest problem with technology, it's like, it's probably going to do a lot of the good you're going to do. But if you think it's only going to do the good you think and none of the bad, you're basically a dumbass. Like the internet, for example, like we said, we can spread information in 2 milliseconds. The problem is, too, you can send a lot of stupid shit over the internet. And you know this. You talk to someone, they say something crazy. Oh, where'd you get that? And they go, I Googled it. It's like, good job. My dog can do that. Doesn't mean shit. I mean, as a medical professional, like you've probably heard like so much shit where you're just like, oh my God, I wish Google never, because you probably can tell someone Googled that shit. But the reason I bring that up is like one thing I tell people, I'm like, why are you big on Bitcoin? They're like, oh man, in 10 years we could help disenfranchised people in the middle of the Congo or people in, South America, blah, blah, blah. Like same thing, there's no reason people should not have basic food, housing, blah, blah, blah. And they say stuff and I agree with them. And then I go, okay, child predators in North Korea start using Bitcoin. They're like, well, they never use it. I'm like, no, let's just play this game with me. Child predators in America and North Koreans start using Bitcoin. He's like, what's your point? I'm like, you don't think CNN and Fox is going to run with that? You don't think that's going to get the AOCs up in DC squawking away? And you just brought something good up. Like I tell people, I am by no means a blind patriot. I was not really a fan of Bush, Obama, Trump. Like, I think most of these idiots in DC, there's too many external factors for them to really care about us. But I tell people, just historically in the last 200 years, America has had a lot of influence on the world for better or worse. But you could say for the most part, it's like maybe a 60-40 split for better. And you just brought up something. One thing that does scare me, even though I'm not a diehard patriot, I could definitely see in my lifetime where I move to another country if I feel America is no longer serving me and representing me. But these, what you just said, it does scare me, and I've been playing this mental mind game myself the last couple months. I'm like, what if North Korea, China, and Russia, they all start getting Bitcoin? You know, it's like that might be okay for the rest of the world, but it's like, what if America's the last of the door there? Are they gonna try to make their own CBDC and fight back? Are they gonna panic and try to buy in, but then because Russia and China were first through the door, that they tell the world how this Bitcoin thing? So I'm like you, like even though it sounds tinfoil hatty, in the last like month or couple months, I've sometimes found myself playing that game where it's like, okay, not if, when some countries start adopting this, how early and or late, what's the latest America could be before, like we said, the Titanic, they missed the lifeboat? Because what you said, if like Iran, Russia, North Korea, China, like Saudi Arabia, they basically all, like you said, they're not going to cozy up, but we're basically bringing our Lego pieces together. Again, I'm not a diehard patriot, but I care about the average person in America, man. Most people are good people. They have an honest 9 to 5 job. They're trying to put food on the table. It's like, how's that going to affect us? And then, like you said, if they all put these Lego pieces together and they just say, hey, this whole OPEC US dollar thing, we're not playing with that doll anymore. Yeah, like we said, we're in the crypto space. The dollar amount may go up, but how is that actually going to affect people? And is this just going to turn to a fucked up Frankenstein? So, like you said, it sounds tinfoil hatty, man. But COVID sounded tinfoil hatty, and it happened, man. So I think just to summarize on what you said, I think it's good to play those mental experiments because same thing. The Titanic never sinks until it does.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where you have to like loosen your mind about like what's possible. I mean, like I follow AI quite closely as well, and if you told me a year ago that something like ChatGPT would be here, I mean, just a year ago, it's what is it, March? Yeah,
Yep.
2022. No, it was on nobody's horizon or prediction, except like if you were like working on the tech yourself, maybe Sanat probably knew, but the general person had no idea that an image to a text to image generator like Midjourney would be here, or ChatGPT would be here, or and this thing is just getting started. It just keeps
Hmm.
getting better and better. So paradigm shifts occur all the time, where something that's been around for a very long time, a system that's been around for a very long time, can get upended. And in the digital realm that we're in, these revolutions and these cycles are spinning a lot faster than they were. And that's because information travels a lot freer now, and there are alternative ways of getting at information that did not exist in the past, and so the government really doesn't control the narrative anymore. I don't know if you saw this, not to get too political on this, but there's this tweet thing, the video going around on YouTube about Fauci going around asking people to get vaccinated in like a Philadelphia neighborhood, right? And I don't know from when it was. It might have been a while ago. It may not be recent at all. But this guy comes out of his like house because Fauci's knocking on the door, and there's a video camera, and he has his entourage and everything, and he's arguing with Fauci. The guy basically just has a wife beater on. He's got a cigarette in his hand. He doesn't look like he's gone to college or anything like that, right? But he pushes back at Fauci at like points that are actually quite good. I mean, if this happened 2 years ago, he was talking. And this person who was talking back to Fauci was like a young man, right? And that's a very safe demographic to be in. If COVID is going around, COVID's not going to likely kill you if you're a young man, right? And he was basically, arguing back, well, as the mortality rate is actually quite low in people my age, and like about, I mean, good points that, that he didn't go to college to learn it, but there's so much information out now that he was able to like get all this data in his brain. And that is such a fundamental shift from a generation ago, where if you wanted to know something, you had two choices: you go to the library, or you turn on the TV for the 9 o'clock evening news, and that was your 20, or you just ask some smart neighbor of yours, that was your source of information, and that was it. And now there's infinite sources. You can't really hide the rot in the system anymore. I think COVID demonstrated a lot of that, where we saw systemic like breakdowns in communications. I mean, an excellent example of this, I think, is the Ukrainian situation, right? So I was old enough to remember when the U.S. went to war in Iraq in 2004, whenever that was, and the entire mainstream media was 100% behind the invasion. They're like, yes, we're patriots, and this is the right thing to do, and if you love your country, you should do this. That it got to mainstream because I remember this very clearly. I think it's hilarious in retrospect. That it's mainstream when even Tom Cruise says we should go and invade Iraq, right? So the reason I remember this is because he was promoting a movie. Ironically, it was War of the Worlds, which was a movie where aliens invade, and he's a part of the movie, and he was doing a tour press with Steven Spielberg, and they asked Tom Cruise, like, what do you think of the war? And Tom Cruise is going the most politically correct person in the world. He's not going to say anything remotely controversial. This was before he jumped the couch, by the way, right? When Tom Cruise still had his cruise control on, and before he became super controversial because of the Scientology stuff. So he was, he's not going to say anything controversial, but he was asked about the Iraq War. He says, yes, I support my government, right? And blah, blah. This is the same guy who, by the way, was in this movie called Born on the 4th of July. And if you've not seen that movie, you have to go see that movie. You will have no appreciation for how good an actor Tom Cruise is until you actually see that movie, which is 1992 or something. It's a very old movie, but it just shows you how talented the guy is. He's a very talented actor. But anyway, but this time around with the Ukraine war, yes, you have the mainstream people, media, waving, red and not red, yellow and blue Ukrainian flags all the time. But there's a large cohort of people who are pushing back. Elon Musk is a great example, right? Is like people whose voices are heard all around the world. Like the folks in the Alden podcast, David Sachs is a good example of this. He says, listen, we should be coming up with some sort of a negotiated settlement because now we're like getting closer and closer to nuclear war, and we don't have strategic interests in this, and this is basically just a manufactured war that the U.S. establishment goaded Russia into getting into, and this is causing destabilization in the world, and it's causing all these people to die. None of these things were said in the run-up to the Iraq War, unless you were like someone like Michael Moore, who did like speak out against the Iraq War, or Ralph Nader, or Bernie Sanders, or a few other people that spoke out against it. And they were considered to be like, communists, right? You must be like a fucking communist if you're against war. Whereas this time, that's not the case at all, just because you have more avenues for discourse and the government does not have a monopoly over information. And that same conduit of information is also screaming a five-alarm fire about the debasement of our monetary network as well, which has also been going on full speed for the last 15 years as well. Right? So that that collective information sources saying that the U.S. Dollar is headed for a massive devaluation. The people who control the monetary network do not know what they're doing. They've over-leveraged us yet again, and the only way to bail out the economy is just to print more money and devalue the money more. And this is now the third time they're doing it. They did it in 2008, they did it in COVID, and here we are again, not even 2 years after COVID, when we have to do it all over again, right? You could even argue that from GFC to now, at least there was 15 years. Well, now we're only 2 years. I mean, the cycles are getting shorter and shorter because once the monetary system starts to collapse, then, like it stumbles and then you hold it up for a while, but it keeps falling.
I know we beat up on him, and sometimes I quote him too much, but Peter Schiff, man, he has a great analogy. Basically, this fun money stimulus is basically just like heroin. And if you talk to anyone who's ever had a drug problem, they say, I used to just do it for fun. I do it at parties, and then something bad happens in their life, and they just are like, okay, I'm just gonna do it for a month or two just to kind of medicate, get through this rough patch or whatever. And then they basically need to do it just to get the fuck out of bed, and then they have to do it more frequently, like you said. They need to up the dosage or whatever. And Charles Cross, he writes a lot of biographies about musicians. Apparently, Kurt Cobain, when he shot himself, he took a huge dose compared to what he did. So apparently his normal dose would have been enough to kill 3 active heroin addicts, and apparently he tripled that. So whatever he took before he shot himself, I guess from the coroner report would have been enough to kill like 10 heroin addicts. And the thing is too, he was in the 27 club, and he only, I think first time he did heroin, I should know this, was like 22 or 23. But basically, like in a 5-year time span, like you said, he built a tolerance that would have killed 10 addicts or whatever. People are like, oh, that would take you a lifetime to do. It's like, no, he did that in 5 years. And to your point, it just escalates real slowly, and that's the thing, like Peter Schiff talks about. It's, we basically either have to get sober, taper up, or we're basically going to overdose. And that's, we were kind of talking on that thread on the last episode. But like you said, it's just like, maybe we were shooting up once a month, and like you said, now we're shooting up like literally every year now. And it's like, when does it end? When, like, what's going to give first? Are we going to get sober, or are they just going to drive us off the cliff until we overdose? It's scary.
That's why Schiff and all the others talk about money printing as an addiction, right?
It is.
Because you built up a tolerance to it after a while, and then you just need more of it, and it spirals out of control. And it's not as if the U.S. monetary network is like the first one that's doing this, right? We've seen collapse of global reserve currencies. Like every century, there's a new one that collapses, right? So the Dutch had one, I forget what it was called, but you had the British sterling pound that collapsed, and now it's the U.S. dollar's turn, perhaps, to be severely devalued. And, if for nothing else, countries may be moving away from the U.S. dollar standard because they're just sick and tired of like dealing with the United States and its, like arrogant foreign policy, where we have, 90, 120 military bases throughout the world, that we're having to pay and print money for to maintain, where we send tens of billions of dollars to countries to fight wars on our behalf, and I'm talking about Ukraine here, where we go to disastrous war after disastrous war because it's just so easy to print money, right? And we did an episode about this like about a month ago where we called it fiat wars, right? If you had to actually pay for the fucking money when you want to go to war, how easy is it really to wage war? It's probably not easy at all, right? If you actually have to pay for it, right? But fiat money printing allows for infinite wars as well. And it's definitely looking like, the dollar system is undergoing like severe challenges, and to what extent cryptocurrency benefits from that unfortunate reality, I think is really something I'm going to be keeping an eye on for the rest of the year. I think that's really the bet that Balaji is making, is that economic energy is going from one system and is entering another system. And I, for one, am starting to believe that that's happening, So that's why I think 10K Bitcoin ain't happening.
Either way, here's the thing. If I'm right, I'm looking forward to Isaac getting me a beer. If I'm wrong, my personal net worth, again, I hope everyone else does as well, but my personal net worth will be happy. So it's like I get a free beer or my net worth goes up. I'm happy either way. So I won't be crying too hard.
You can't lose. You can't lose in that scenario. Well, I'm thinking on that optimistic note, since we leave it on optimistic notes all the time, we should leave it for next time.